50,000 years. That's the number that came back from the lab. 50,000 years, plus or minus, a margin so narrow the technicians ran the sample 3 separate times to be sure. To put that in perspective, the accepted scientific consensus says human beings didn't set foot in the Americas until somewhere between 15 and 25,000 years ago. The object that triggered this number was hauled out of the Bering Sea by a commercial halibut crew working roughly 80 nautical miles southwest of St. Paul Island. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't driftwood. According to the preliminary report filed with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, it was worked bone, shaped, polished, pierced. The crew on the FV Northern Resolve weren't looking for archaeology that morning. They were dragging long lines for Pacific halibut in waters that have been fished commercially for over a century, in a region where the seafloor has been scraped, trawled, and surveyed thousands of times. The captain, a third-generation fisherman named Eric Lindstrom, has told local Alaskan news outlets that he initially thought the object tangled in his gear was a piece of broken whalebone, the sort of thing crews occasionally pull up and toss back. But something about the surface stopped him. Geometric grooves ran along one side. A hole had been bored cleanly through the thicker end, the kind of hole no current or sea creature carves. He brought it onto the deck, wrapped it in an oilcloth, and at the end of the trip handed it to a fisheries observer, who happened to be native Alaskan and who recognized immediately that what she was looking at was almost certainly a tool. From there, the object moved through the regional NO and fisheries office, then up to the anthropology department at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where it sat for weeks while curators argued about whether it was worth the cost of full radiocarbon analysis. Eventually, they sent a small shaving to a specialist lab. The number that came back didn't just contradict the textbook timeline, it rewrote what should have been possible. And then the questions started. Because if the dating is right, and if the object really is what it appears to be, then somebody was alive on the edge of the North Pacific tens of thousands of years before any human being was supposed to be anywhere near it. Researchers believe the implications, if they hold, would reshape one of the most stubbornly defended chapters in American prehistory. To understand why a single dated artifact could provoke this much disagreement, you have to back up. Way back, the story of how humans reached the Americas has been argued and rewritten more times than almost any other migration question in archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model was straightforward and confident. Sometime around 13,000 years ago, after the last glacial maximum, a population of big game hunters crossed a land bridge called Beringia, walked through an ice-free corridor that opened between 2 retreating ice sheets and spread south. They were called the Clovis people, named for the distinctive fluted spear points first identified near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. The Clovis first model wasn't just a theory. It was, for decades, treated as settled fact. Graduate students who proposed older dates were quietly told to find another topic. Then came Monteverde, in southern Chile, a site dated to roughly 14,500 years ago, excavated by Dr. Tom Dillihay of Vanderbilt University, finally cracked the consensus. After years of bitter peer review, Monteverde was accepted in the late 90s as genuinely pre-Clovis. The wall fell. Once it did, other sites that had been ignored or dismissed started getting fresh looks. Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, originally dated by Jacques Cinq-Mars to as far back as 24,000 years, slowly worked its way back into the mainstream conversation. More recently, footprints preserved in gypsum at White Sands, New Mexico, were dated to between 21 and 23,000 years old, a finding published in Science in 2021 that pushed the accepted human presence in North America back by thousands of years overnight. So the timeline keeps moving. Each generation of archaeologists assumes its number as the floor, and then a new site, a new dating technique, or a new sample shifts the floor again. The current outer edge of mainstream acceptance sits around 23 to 25,000 years for any credible human presence in the Americas. 50,000 is in a different category entirely. 50,000 is so far outside the established window that even the researchers who pushed hardest for pre-Clovis acceptance tend to grow cautious when the number is mentioned out loud. Evidence suggests the upper limit isn't a wall built out of stubbornness alone. There are reasons, real ones, why 50,000-year dates from the Americas have historically failed under scrutiny. And those reasons are exactly what the skeptics are pointing to now. The object itself, according to the preliminary description circulated among researchers, is roughly 14 centimeters long, slightly curved, and made from what an initial analysis identified as the long bone of a large terrestrial mammal. The leading candidate based on bone density and cortical thickness is mammoth, or mastodon, though some specialists have suggested it could be from a steppe bison. 3 parallel grooves run along the dorsal surface, each cut at roughly the same depth, suggesting deliberate work with a sharp-edged tool rather than the random scoring you get from teeth, ice, or sand abrasion. One end has been ground down into a tapered point. The other end tarries that bored hole, which under microscopy shows the rotational striations consistent with hand drilling using a wooden shaft and an abrasive. In other words, by every visible criterion, it looks like a tool somebody made on purpose. Researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks reportedly compared the morphology to known Upper Paleolithic bone implements from Siberia, particularly from sites along the Yana River, where mammoth ivory and bone tools dating to around 32,000 years ago have been recovered in well-documented contexts. The Alaskan object doesn't perfectly match any single Yana category, but the general technological grammar is similar. Cut, drill, polish. The shape is consistent with what some specialists call a foreshaft, a piece designed to socket into a longer spear or harpoon and hold a sharpened point. If that interpretation holds, the object isn't ornamental. It's hunting deer. The kind of hunting deer that someone would carry into a coastal environment to take seal, walrus, or migrating sea mammals. The recovery location adds another layer of strangeness. The Bering Sea today is open ocean. 50,000 years ago, during what climatologists call the marine isotope stage 3 interstadial, sea levels were significantly lower, and large portions of what is now seafloor were exposed land. The Barringen landmass connected Asia and North America in a continuous plain that some researchers have estimated stretched 1,000 miles north to south. There would have been rivers, lakes, tundra, and coastal margins where today there's only water. So the artifact, if it really is 50,000 years old, didn't fall off a boat. It would have been dropped, lost, or buried on dry ground, then slowly inundated as the ice sheets melted and the seas rose over thousands of years. The bone would have been preserved in the cold, low-oxygen environment of marine sediment, eventually settling at the depth where the halibut cruise gear snagged it. That sequence is at least plausible. The Bering and Chukchi seafloors do, in fact, preserve mammoth remains and other Pleistocene materials, and a small but real number of worked bone fragments have been pulled up by trawlers over the decades. Most of those have been undated or ambiguously dated, and most have been quietly archived rather than published. The current find is unusual, mainly because it was caught early, handed off to professionals quickly, and tested under controlled conditions before it could be lost or contaminated. That brings us to the dating itself, which is where the entire story either holds together or falls apart. The technique used was accelerator mass spectrometry, the gold standard for radiocarbon analysis. A microscopic sample was extracted from the interior of the bone to minimize surface contamination, treated to remove any carbon-bearing modern intrusions, and run through the instrument. The result, according to the report, came back at approximately 49,800 years before present, with a stated uncertainty of plus or minus 1,100 years. And here's where the skeptics start sharpening their knives. Carbon-14 radiocarbon dating has a hard ceiling. The half-life of carbon-14 is roughly 5,700 years, which means after about 50,000 years, there's almost nothing left to measure. Researchers in the field will tell you bluntly that any date past 40,000 years is treated as approximate at best, and any date that lands within a few thousand years of the 50,000-year ceiling is automatically suspect. The technical reason is straightforward. The amount of remaining carbon-14 in a sample that old is so small that even trace contamination from younger carbon, the kind that can seep in from groundwater, microbial activity, conservation adhesives, or even the cleaning solvents used in the lab, can artificially inflate the apparent age toward the instrument's detection limit. In plain terms, a sample that is actually, say, 60,000 years old, or 80,000, or 200,000, will often come back reading roughly 50,000. Not because that's the real number, but because that's where the math collapses. Dr. Tom Dillehay, the same researcher whose Monte Verde work helped break the Clovis First Dam, has been quoted in interviews on similar finds saying, in essence, that he treats any pre-30,000-year date from the Americas as a hypothesis to be tested, not a conclusion. Other specialists, including geochronologist Dr. Thomas Stafford and several researchers associated with the Center for the Study of the First Americans at Texas A&M, have made similar arguments over the years. Their position isn't that ancient human presence in the Americas is impossible. Their position is that the dating methods we have right now aren't precise enough to confirm it, and that any extraordinary claim needs extraordinary, redundant evidence. One theory proposes that the Alaskan artifact, if it really is bone, could in fact be old, possibly much older than 50,000 years, but that the carbon date is essentially meaningless because the instrument is being pushed to its breaking point. Another possibility, raised more cautiously, is that the bone is genuinely around 50,000 years old as a piece of natural material, but the markings interpreted as tool work could have been produced by natural processes such as scavenger gnawing, sediment compression, or freeze-thaw fracturing. The cleanly bored hole is the hardest feature to explain away naturally, but skeptics point out that ice wedging in marrow cavities can occasionally produce surprisingly round perforations. A third possibility, which researchers at UAF are reportedly investigating, is that the bone itself is genuinely ancient, but the tool modifications were made much later, possibly by a much more recent population working with old naturally preserved mammoth bone, the way carvers do today with mammoth ivory pulled from Siberian permafrost. If that's the case, the artifact could be a few thousand years old at most, even though its raw material reads as ancient. Each of those alternatives has to be ruled out before the headline date can be defended. None of them is easy to rule out quickly. What happens next? Assuming the research team follows standard protocol is a long, unglamorous process of additional testing. Researchers believe the path forward involves multiple independent labs running their own dates on separate fragments of the same object. It involves uranium series dating of any associated sediment, which can extend reliably past the carbon-14 ceiling. It involves protein residue analysis to check for traces of blood, hide, or marine mammal tissue on the working surfaces. And it involves a careful look at the broader sediment context of the area where the artifact was recovered, ideally through a return expedition to the seafloor site to look for stratigraphic evidence, additional finds, or anything that might place the single object inside a recoverable archaeological layer. That return expedition has reportedly been proposed, but not funded. The Bering Sea is not a forgiving research environment. Weather windows are short. Ship time is expensive, and the political and scientific risk of investing heavily in a find that may turn out to be an artifact of methodology rather than a paradigm shifter is not small. Still, the find has caught attention. Discussions reportedly have begun between UAF, the Smithsonian's Arctic Study Center, and at least one Russian institution that has decades of experience with Siberian Paleolithic sites. If the dating holds up under cross-laboratory replication, the implications run wider than archaeology. A date of 50,000 years would force a fundamental rethinking of the Beringen standstill hypothesis. That hypothesis, developed in part by Drs. Erika Thom, Dennis O'Rourke, and others, proposes that the founding population of the Americas spent thousands of years living in isolation on the Beringen land bridge itself before pushing south. The genetic evidence, drawn from mitochondrial DNA as studies of modern Native American populations, has been read by most researchers as supporting a standstill period that began somewhere around 25 to 30,000 years ago. Pushing the human presence back to 50,000 would mean either that the standstill started far earlier than the genetics currently suggests, or that there was an entirely earlier wave of human movement into Beringia that left no surviving descendants and no other recovered evidence. Either possibility is conceivable. Neither is comfortable. There's a deeper layer to the implications, and it has to do with what we assume about the people who would have been on that landscape. 50,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were established in Africa and had begun spreading into Eurasia, but the populations in northeastern Siberia at that time are still poorly understood. Some specialists have raised the possibility that early arrivals to Beringia might not have been modern Homo sapiens at all, but rather another hominin group, possibly Denisovans, whose genetic traces survive in modern populations across Asia and Oceania. Denisovan remains have been recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia and from a jawbone found on the Tibetan Plateau, and there's been speculation, still highly contested, that Denisovan populations may have extended further north and east than current evidence directly supports. If, and this is a very large if, the Alaskan artifact represents a Denisovan or hybrid presence on the eastern edge of Beringia, the story of human movement into the Americas becomes something nobody currently has a framework to discuss. Researchers familiar with the find have been careful to avoid that particular speculation publicly. The reasons are obvious. Without genetic material recovered directly from the artifact or from human remains in the same context, any claim about who made it would be guesswork. And guesswork is exactly what has tripped up similar finds in the past. So the artifact sits for now in a climate-controlled cabinet at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, while researchers argue, refine, and prepare for the next round of testing. The fishermen who pulled it up have moved on to other seasons. The waters where it came from have closed over the spot. Whatever else might be down there, whether tools, bones, or simply more questions, remains buried in cold mud under 1,000 feet of ocean. And the timeline of the first Americans, the one that gets printed in textbooks and taught in classrooms, sits in the same uneasy place it's been sitting for a quarter century, waiting for the next piece of evidence to either confirm it or break it open. There's something quietly humbling in the way a single object can rearrange so much certainty. A piece of bone, the length of a forearm, carried up out of darkness by accident into the hands of strangers who happened to look at it twice. The story of who we are, where we came from, and how we ended up scattered across the continents has been told, and retold by every culture that ever asked the question, and the version we live with now is just the latest draft. Evidence suggests it won't be the last. Whether this particular artifact rewrites the chapter or quietly slides into the archive of beautiful unresolved cases, the deeper lesson holds. The past isn't a fixed thing. It's a conversation we keep having, with the ground beneath us and with the people, our ancestors or somebody else's, who left behind the small, deliberate marks of their passing. We pick those marks up. We turn them over. We argue about what they mean. And in the arguing, we remember that the world is older, stranger, and more full of forgotten lives than any single timeline could ever hold.